Welcome to New Atlas Live. I'm Brian Berletic, and joining me today is Danny Haiphong, and we're going to talk a little bit about recent events, and then we want to get into Danny's recent travels across Asia. He has a lot of interesting observations about what he saw in relation to this topic of multipolarism that we both tried to focus on. So welcome, Danny. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Thanks for having me back on your show, Brian. It's good to be with you.
That's it. And welcome everyone who is tuning in live. And please check the video description below for everywhere you can find and follow Danny's work. And we'll remind everyone again toward the end of the show. So let's just begin with what is going on. Let's start with Ukraine. And this is a topic that I've talked about often. Oops, hold on a second. Let's see. Yes, this. Here we go. Artillery shell production, and the U.S. is ahead of schedule to meet their targets. The EU is hopelessly behind. And they, if you read this Defense One article, it almost sounds like Europe is not ever going to pull it together. But for the United States, they need additional congressional money. I believe they will eventually get that money. And they plan on making probably 1.2 million shells a year by the end of 2025, which is something that I've been saying. And I've always assumed that Europe would be able to match that. And so this would double, and this would be right around where Russia is now, currently producing artillery shells. This article makes an interesting point about how the U.S. always talks about free markets, but it's actually the U.S. Army's ownership of the production facilities that allowed them to increase production much more quickly than the EU, which is all private companies. And they don't want to increase production because they worry that if peace breaks out, they're going to be left with all this additional production and no way of recuperating their costs. What do you think about this news story, Danny?
Well, it seems like more hope, reaching out for hope. There's been story after story now, it feels like in the Western mainstream media too, of Ukraine's manpower problem, the fact that they have essentially sent everyone they could out to that front line, only to have them decimated, killed in action, or injured and unable to fight. And so this constant talk about weapons seems to be denying the inevitable reality, which is that this conflict will not be resolved on anyone else's terms except for Russia's, that Russia doesn't face any of these problems. And it is quite curious now that the Western mainstream media, and I know we've both been covering this for the last half a year plus since the counteroffensive started to be discussed, Ukraine's vaunted counteroffensive, is that over the course of this time, there have been increasing numbers of articles, reports, admissions from across the collective West that there really is a shortage. The things that we've been saying for a long time, but shortage of ammunition, shortage of arms, now shortage of manpower. I mean, all of these things point only in one direction, and that is Russia's eventual victory. And it's a matter of when, not if. And so for me, these stories just, it's interesting also to see the energy behind them. There's a lot of pessimism. There's a lot of, I think, pause in terms of where this conflict is going for the collective West and from the collective West. And the United States really now is heading the charge toward shifting and maneuvering itself away from this conflict in the realm of public relations. It doesn't really, the Biden administration is not embracing this. The neocons aren't really championing it in the same way. While they maintain their overall line, there have been just indication after indication, even in the last several weeks, that there's only one direction this conflict can go in and will go in, and that's not going to change.
Yes, and another thing that I want to bring up is this idea that that Russia is maybe they're winning, but they're paying this extremely heavy cost. And I've gone over to MediaZona many times. This is something Alexander Micuras just pointed out in his most recent video. We were waiting to see if MediaZona would pick up on this catastrophic loss of Russian life and equipment that Ukraine and the Western media claimed It's taking place around Avdiivka, outside of Donetsk city in the Donbas region. And you can see that there is actually an increase. But Ukrainian sources are saying 1,000 dead every single day. And if you click on some of the high points, it's like 30, 40, 50, somewhere around there. So much fewer, far fewer losses than Ukraine claims. But I mean, does that surprise you at all, Danny? Isn't that what they've been doing since the very beginning? Exaggerating absolutely everything, covering up their losses, exaggerating what they claim is Russia's losses. And how much longer are they going to be able to do this? Especially, you mentioned the pessimism that is starting to creep into the Western media. And we know the Western media is a reflection of the mindset of people actually making and pushing policy. So what does that tell you? I mean, do you think they're going to, this is a question I ask myself, are they just going to kind of give up, just try to perpetuate it for as long as possible and distract? We're going to talk about Gaza next. Are they going to do that? Or are they going to learn any lessons? Because I'm throwing many questions at you, Danny, but I know you can handle it. One other question. Are they learning anything, because they're pivoting toward the Middle East, but ultimately their sights are set on China? And if they could not win against Russia, how are they going to win against a much larger, more powerful China, which is also working together with Russia?
I mean, the answer is they're not. But I think the big issue I see here now is that Ukraine reminds me of, like a hospital patient, many different ailments. Perhaps they're at an age where it is indeed their time to go, but the family doesn't want to let them go. They want to use all the measures possible to keep them afloat and to keep the fight going, even though it's likely that this person needs to be laid to rest, and that it is their time. And that is kind of how this conflict feels right now. I mean, in area after area, in point after point, whether we're looking at the ammunition problem, we're looking at the losses. I mean, it's just laughable that the collective West and Ukraine would talk about Russian losses, and Russia takes their losses very seriously, and that's why they are fighting the war that they're fighting right now. It's why they're fighting a war of attrition rather than a full scale conflict, is because they do not want to see the kind of numbers that Ukraine has witnessed over the past several months alone. I mean, the counteroffensive alone likely has taken nearly 100,000 Ukrainian troops. I think the rough number is 90,000. But if we chop that up into per day numbers, I mean, we're talking about a massive loss of life. That's nearly 3,000 per day if we're thinking, or several, or 1,000 per day, depending on how far across these number of lives were lost. So a lot of this is just covering up the reality that Russia takes their losses seriously, but they are by far nowhere near what Ukraine has experienced. And it really does have to do with the fact that Ukraine, up until now, when they have been forced to fight a so-called war of attrition, which really is just an operational pause for them, they have been just grinding and grinding and grinding their forces, wasting away all of NATO's supplies, all of the supplies that they've been given, after army just gone. And I think there is no lesson learned here, because the United States and NATO are more than happy to drag out the dying carcass of Ukraine as far as it can go, as long as it can breathe, as long as there is any semblance of functionality, if we can even call it that, when it comes to Ukrainian armed forces, when it comes to the Ukrainian government. As long as that is still standing, they're willing to take this as far as it goes, despite knowing that it's not going to progress. There's not going to be any forward motion, and there's not going to be any possibility of achieving the ultimate objective of this conflict, which was to weaken Russia. That objective has failed. Russia is not weaker. Arguably, Russia is stronger. There is a saying that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And this conflict indeed has made Russia stronger in many ways. Russia has increased its military capacity, its industrial capacity, as well as its manpower. It's increased its economic resilience. And of course, uh, such is the case with every time the collective West has tried to escalate with Russia. Political stability is through the roof. People do support the Russian government for its, for its valiant effort to prevent what many people in Russia and indeed the entire world see as a huge threat, which is NATO expansion, which is the attacks that were occurring on ethnic Russians in Donbass. I mean, all of this was not viewed favorably by most of the world, except for those NATO countries and the United States leading them. So all of this is to say is now that there is a pivot away from Ukraine, there is no lesson learned. They're going to try to repeat these same disasters. They are trying to repeat them in West Asia, in the Asia Pacific, all across the world, because it really is the only model that they have at their disposal. When you think about the United States, you think about NATO, you don't necessarily think about resilience or adaptability or lessons learned, because there is this laundry list of examples that show that NATO, the United States at its head, it fights one way and one way only, and that is through war, and that is through taking aggressive maneuvers and aggressive actions to satisfy those who control NATO, which is Washington and which is the interests that control Washington. So ultimately, as you said earlier, when the war dries up, that's something they don't want to see. The military contractors don't want to see it. There's a lot of people who don't want to see the conflict in Ukraine end in any kind of total capacity. And I think there were reports that Kiev and Zelensky's top parliamentary politician, the top member of the so-called servant of the people party, I mean, he himself has admitted that it was the collective West, the United States, the UK, etc., who torpedoed the ability for peace to actually be achieved in spring of 2022. And that now is confirmed by a top member of the Ukrainian government itself, Zelensky's own party, showing that this is the direction. I mean, that's why there has been no real efforts toward a negotiated settlement. It doesn't seem like, no matter how bad it gets on the battlefield, no matter how uncertain the future looks for Ukraine, it doesn't seem to be enough to compel the United States to finally push the Ukrainian government and itself back to the table and actually create some kind of window and exit ramp for them to to pursue. So now the lessons won't be learned. In fact, uh, the future is very uncertain, because it is quite likely that regardless of whatever machinations have occurred over the last several months between the US and China, and regardless of what happens even in Gaza and Palestine and the larger West Asia region, even if that slows down to any degree, I think this moment in history shows that these flashpoints, they don't just go away. There is no transformation of the situation. It really is just how far the United States, of course, and its vassal states are willing to go in pursuing their objectives, whether they slow down a bit or they really push the accelerator and attempt to take everything by force. And I think we're seeing with Ukraine that model doesn't even work anymore, but they're going to continue to pursue it because it's the only thing that they have. They can't offer economic development, trade, anything like that. They can't offer that to Ukraine, which is its own puppet state in the making, but certainly they can't offer that to the rest of the world. They can't sit down with Russia lest they look like they're weak, and they can't even uh, uh, make good on whatever diplomatic overtures they make toward China. So all of this, they can't even keep control of the U.S. can't even control their attack dog Israel when it comes to how far it's willing to go to pursue its own very narrow and very destructive and gruesomely destructive interests in West Asia. It can't even do that because every time the United States is put in a position where it has to act like some kind of functional state in the international arena, where it actually has to look at the letter of the law and follow it, even if it's in its best interest, it can't and it won't do it because there is a I think there is a signal that that sends to those elites that really do benefit from war that something could change dramatically, and so any attempt to inch a little bit away from the cliff is indeed doing the unthinkable. So it stands in complete contrast to what much of humanity thinks, which is, well, the United States seems to be just provoking and pursuing just unthinkable possibilities and possible events in the theater of war, which no one else wants except for a very tiny few that are heading this disastrous operation.
Yeah, and I agree. This is not weakening Russia. Beyond that, it's actually strengthening the multipolar world. If you think about it, the sanctions especially forced Russia to explore alternatives to all of these systems that had been cut off from, that the West had been monopolizing for decades. And this was something that has been in the works for many years. This wasn't something that Russia did overnight, but it was the perfect opportunity, not just for Russia to turn to these alternatives and really concentrate on building them up, but the rest of the world was looking at this also. Even nations that are supposedly allies with the US, they're looking at this and thinking, we could be next. We need to get out of this. It's time to divest. This is getting ugly. We cannot trust anything the US or Europe says. They're blowing up pipelines. They're out of control. And just think about any investor or anyone who's trying to build anything. What do you want more than anything? You want stability, and you want to work with people who are predictable. Even if they're bad people, you want them to be predictable. The West is almost falling back on the idea that, well, we're weak, everything is failing, but at least if we could be unpredictable, maybe that will give us an advantage. But in actuality, that just turns more of the world off. And there were a couple other things that I wanted to say about Ukraine. You still see a large segment of the pro-Ukrainian community, commentators, who are holding on to, they're trying to cross the river, this river crossing of the Dnieper River around Kherson. They're desperately trying to portray that as the offensive continues, when in reality this is even more disastrous than the actual offense, the offensive that is now admittedly, even by Ukraine, to have failed. Then there was this storm that hit Crimea and the surrounding areas and in Russia, and it caused a lot of damage. And actually, just however long this storm blew in and blew out for, it caused more damage than I think Ukraine has caused for Crimea over the last 2 years of fighting. And I saw a lot of people, this is how you know things are getting real desperate. When people are looking at this storm and the damage that it's doing and thinking, maybe this will turn things around. Maybe we can, it's like an act of God. You're waiting for an act of God now to intervene. This is when people are delusional and refuse to accept inevitability. So I think that's all really important to point out. I think let's shift to the situation in Gaza. I really want to spend most of the time talking with you about what you saw and did in Asia. But we see this exchange, prisoners being exchanged. There's the possibility that this ceasefire, this temporary ceasefire, might be extended. But Israel has vowed that once the exchange is over, they're going to go right back at it. And I think this is just my idea, and then you can let me know what you think, Danny. If Israel decides to go back fighting, I think it kind of will verify what I fear, is that Israel is going to go all the way. They see this as a window of opportunity. the U.S. also sees this as a window of opportunity to finally solve the Palestinian issue their way. They don't want a two-state solution. They want to keep the entire region divided and in conflict. So this is the best way for them to do it. I don't think if they go for peace, this will buy time that everyone else in the world outside of the West and Israel, everyone else in the world can continue working on this, focusing on how to actually solve this problem and end all of the fighting in the entire region. What do you think about these recent developments? I saw some people in the comment section saying the ceasefire collapse. I have to verify that, but I just checked this right before we went live, so I don't know, but it could change hour to hour. What do you think about all of this, Danny?
Well, it appears that there, I think there will be another 48 hours of a supposed truce, and all of it is around the prisoners of war, Israel's and Palestinian side,
Two-day
exchanging them.
extension. Sorry, I
Yeah,
just checked it. Two
yeah.
days.
There's going to
Go
be a
ahead.
2-day extension, but I think there's a lot of I follow this former British diplomat Alastair Crooke, who actually did some of these truces when he was a top diplomat over at the EU, and he made a really good point that all of this is theater in many ways, especially on the Israeli side, because there are some, I think, stark realities that and some questions that we have to ask. For one, this whole operation that Israel has been waging, so supposedly in response to the Hamas raid, supposedly in response to October 7th, we have to ask ourselves, what war is Israel actually fighting? Because we all know, and everybody who watches this program and anyone who's going to see this video afterward likely knows, that Israel has killed a lot of Palestinians. There's a whole lot of Palestinians, and it's questionable whether they've killed anyone who legitimately fights for Hamas or the Palestinian resistance in general. We actually don't really know that. Israel doesn't like to count those numbers, but there's a lot of documentation of the mass murder of Palestinians. Many of them, if not 100% of them, civilians. So we have to ask what war are they actually fighting, because Israel right now is in this supposed truce, but they're also engaged, and that might be what some might be referring to as a ceasefire breaking down, is they still are engaged in pretty active combat in the West Bank. It just looks a little different. They're incarcerating Palestinians. Palestinians are dying in the West Bank. And what is, in past terms has been called an intifada, where Palestinians say, okay, no more of this. We're going to fight back. And then Israel ends up killing a lot of them. And that has happened in the West Bank many times. So it's hard to know whether that's actually going on now, what stage that is at, but we do know that Palestinians in the West Bank are being killed and incarcerated. So what is there really a truce here? Because if it's happening in Gaza, that there's a so-called truce, but Israel is conducting fighting in the West Bank, could there actually be a so-called truce if we look at this beyond the narrow lens of are Hamas and Israel engaged in legitimate talks with each other? I don't really think that's the issue here, but all in all, I think I think your instincts are right, Brian, in terms of Israel's and of course the United States at the head, what they're thinking. For me, this feels a lot like an attempt to allow for some pressure to be let off in the field of public relations. Israel has been hit really hard. World public opinion, it was already low on Israel's position on the Palestine question, but it's even lower now given what it has done in Gaza. The United States has taken a major hit, especially the Biden administration has taken a major hit because of this, not just domestically, but internationally. So a lot of this feels like an attempt to release some pressure without any real commitment that something is going to change. It is. I think this is 100% right. I think that Israel wants to solve the Palestine question through force, through violence, and through elimination and complete displacement. There are rumors. There are, um, people are bandying the idea that Israel will likely start targeting the south of Gaza, which ironically they've pushed Palestinians toward in an attempt to push them into Egypt and force the surrounding region to accept essentially the entire population of Gaza, or what's left of it after the bombing campaign. So all this is to say, I think that that is likely to occur. However, again, we have to ask what war is Israel really fighting here? Because obviously, after many, many years, we can say Israel has never really been engaged in any serious fighting with Hamas or even Palestinian resistance. What it really has been doing is been collectively punishing a population and collectively suppressing and decimating a population for both its interests and also U.S. interests. Because I do heavily believe that this conflict is not simply about resolving the Palestine question. It's obvious that Israel is also fighting a larger war. We can see that in the fact that in the last couple of days, Israel has conducted another round of airstrikes in Syria. They've taken down again, made unoperational, the international airport in Damascus. All of this is just part and parcel of what Israel has been doing for a long time, which is being that military installation of the United States. It doesn't mean that it's controlled, it doesn't have its own interests, but it does act like an operating force for the United States militarily to continue the process, what looked like a dead process of creating untold and permanent chaos in the region, destabilizing. If Israel is killing everything that moves in Gaza, certainly the U.S. and Israel, and of course, whatever Western vassals want to follow along, they have been trying to destabilize everything that moves independently in that region. They've been trying to weaken Hezbollah for many decades. They've been trying to overthrow Iran for many decades. The war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, all of these wars were fought for the same purpose, which is to destabilize the region and make it more politically tenable to maintain a huge hegemonic grasp over the resources and as well as the geostrategic position that this very valuable piece of land, as they see it, forget the nations, forget the people, they see it as a region that is incredibly valuable economically, politically, and militarily to U.S. supremacy. And that's the war that Israel is fighting. Palestinians are, of course, the major sacrifice for that war, ones that have people that have been dehumanized and seen as just ready for immediate slaughter. But the entire region and the people in it who see themselves and identify heavily with the Palestinian people, we see this in how Hezbollah talks about it, how Iran, how all of these countries in the region, even the most subservient to the United States, they have a pretty strong position in favor of Palestine. It's because they know that the people sympathize and empathize with that situation. And they also know that many of them at least know that this is not simply just about Israel. Israel is an extension of a larger problem, a parasite occupying the region at the behest of the United States and Washington and its interest to lay waste to the region so that it can plunder it and it can dominate it and it can use it as a springboard for these conflicts that we've been talking about, for this Cold War against Russia, for the Cold War against China. All roads of conflict lead there. That's often a missing piece of this, is that oftentimes people view these conflicts in terms of silos. Where are they located? This is happening there. But really what the United States sees in West Asia is a road to war with Russia and China, because they see this region as critical for both countries. Both countries genuinely need and have genuinely positive relationships with all countries in this region, and they want to see that go away. And they especially want to see it go away in the areas where those relationships are the strongest, are the most sovereign, and are the most oriented toward a multipolar world. Of course, that means Iran, that means Syria, that means getting rid of Hezbollah's influence in Lebanon. That means cutting the axis of resistance completely off. And Palestine is a great place to try to do this because it's virtually impossible militarily to fight a country like Iran. They lost in Syria. They're still trying to fight that war. It's not happening. They know that China and Russia uh, uh, have a harder time with supporting militarily and economically a so-called question of statehood like Palestine versus legitimately sovereign countries recognized in the international arena. And that is the very unfortunate, and I think very, it just goes to show how inhumane the United States is that it is willing to use the Palestinian people, literally have them get killed in massive numbers in order to try to get their way in the region. And that's why we've seen reports of worries from Lloyd Austin, worries from the neocons that they're going to be dragged into a larger war. That's not worries about getting dragged into a larger war. That's an admission that there is the possibility of a risk of a larger war, and the U.S. wants to manage it in a way that's controllable, while Israel is completely unhinged and does not have any sense. If Israel cannot fight hand to hand with Hamas in Gaza, it has no sense of how to fight a regional war. Israel just goes, right? It bombs Damascus. It just goes because it has full freedom. It has full leverage. It doesn't really have any consequences. The United States knows that it needs to be on top. It needs to somehow find a way to control both the outcomes and the narrative behind the outcomes. And so that's why they're worried. But they know this is a regional war because they're the ones who have been leading it and aiding Israel and aligning with Israel as they both collectively fight their own version and visions for what that would look like. It really is it's definitely not a match made in heaven because these two countries, Israel and the United States, do not always see eye to eye. But it is a real it is a real, it's a mafia kind of like partnership. They view themselves as having very similar goals. While they don't always disagree, they're going to align on what's most important. And I do truly think that's why the United States continues, despite all of its rhetoric of a two-state solution, all of that is just the hegemon trying to look like it is a fair and decent player on the world stage. It knows, the U.S. knows, the ruling elite, the neocons, they all know that the ultimate objective is to gain as much of a foothold in West Asia as possible. Palestinians, just like Ukrainians, just like Iraqis, and they are just, they are just cannon fodder. And the only reason Palestinians and the Palestine question is so prominent in the U.S. as a talk in a certain way is because of world public opinion and because of how people feel about this, and because there is a strong push to recognize the human rights of Palestinians, because they don't have a state, because they don't have a nation, they don't have self-determination, they don't have any rights under international law right now. They should have them, but they are not respected to any degree. So that's why the United States has to talk in a certain way, but they don't have to talk like that around Syrians. They don't have to talk like that about Iranians or Hezbollah or anybody else. They don't have to talk like that because they can kind of fight in the theater of war in a way that is more accepted. So this is the quandary that the United States finds itself in. This situation in Gaza is likely not to end, but I do think we see in this unexpected truce that there is a possibility this could wind down. The more the uglier and uglier this gets overall, the United States and the rest of the collective West, they can't allow this situation to turn into what it already looks like it's turning into at such a rapid manner without huge consequences, not just in terms of their own public relations and how they look, but also in terms of the fallout regionally and globally. Because the more isolated Israel becomes because of this, the more isolated the United States and, of course, the rest of the collective West, if it has any credibility anymore, is also likely to become.
Yeah, well, I think the West is isolating itself. It began doing that even before the conflict in Ukraine, but the conflict in Ukraine has really accelerated this isolation. And it's ironic because they're becoming more isolated while at the same time trying to isolate Russia China, and now a growing list of nations that are not going along with their dictates. And you made a lot of good points, and I just want to touch on a couple of them. The idea of this ceasefire kind of breaking the momentum from this growing outrage that we see globally. They know people have a limited attention span. If they could drag out this ceasefire for a while, maybe get, again, break the momentum that we see building up in opposition to Israel, and also the realization that the U.S. is enabling this. Without the U.S., this could not even happen. And as you point out, the U.S. wants to appear to be acting diplomatically, all while they bend over backwards to send weapons to Israel, allocate money and additional weapons and ammunition to continue sending them, even while saying, "Oh, Israel, please show some restraint," while pouring oil onto the fire, essentially. And the other point, and this is a point that I've been trying to make, just as the U.S. used the conflict in Ukraine to consolidate control over Europe, to completely cut Europe off from cooperation with Russia, and also to a certain extent China, and really accelerate these dependencies Europe has on, or enlarge in the dependencies Europe has on the United States. I think they're trying to do the same thing with this conflict in Gaza, in the Middle East, or West Asia. And think about Saudi Arabia, how they're kind of sneaking out from under U.S. hegemony. Turkey has been doing this very slow pivot, and many other countries in the region have been doing this. Maybe they think that this conflict can create divisions and instability, as you were saying, and this could give them opportunities to consolidate control over this region, just as they did in Europe with the conflict in Ukraine. One last thing that you've said that I think is really essential for people to understand: do not look at these conflicts in silos. They are not isolated. Don't become overly obsessed with individual ideologies that are real and toxic, but are being used to get people dragged into the conflict. It's not the ideology driving the conflict. The ideology is being used to pull people into it and keep it going. There's the actual purpose pushing all of this is U.S. hegemony, and so we see Zionism, for example, in Israel. This is a real thing. It exists. No one denies that. But people focus entirely too much on just that, and they don't look beyond what is behind it and what is using it. And if you look at Ukraine, it's not Zionism, it's Nazism, but it's very similar when you really look at the root of it. And if you look at, and we're going to talk about Asia next, the mentality of the opposition groups the U.S. cultivates here in Asia. I'm based in Asia. The idea that if you speak English and you think and act like a Westerner, you're superior to everyone else. And all of these people and their cultures are all backwards and ridiculous and need to be washed clean from the region. That's how they think. And how is that different than Nazism or Zionism? That is if you look at the common denominator, it's U.S. support. And that is how the U.S. creates cadres in every single location on Earth to advance their interests in each one of these places. And then when you zoom out, you see that they're trying to consolidate control over the entire planet. And it's empire. It's modern day empire, and that's how they do it. So I think we did a good job in about half an hour covering Ukraine, Gaza, and I think we're getting very deep into the actual cause driving all of this, and we see how they're connected. You recently took a trip to Asia, and I say all the time, and Angelo, who's on often, he always says, people need to go, especially to China. Go to China, see China for yourself. You're not going to be able to get a grip on what is going on there by looking at the Western media, for sure. And I would say the same goes for, say, Thailand, where I'm based. Westerners have so many knuckle-dragging, ignorance misconceptions about Thailand. It's all because of the Western media and Hollywood depicting it a certain way. When you actually live here, you can see it's not like that at all. So why don't you explain where you went and what you saw? And you can organize it any way that you want. And while you do that, if people have questions related to what we're talking about, just put a capital Q or question in all caps and I'll star it, and we'll try to address it as soon as possible. But right before we go to that, how about we do this? Tim Doomy says Danny and Brian really hate the West. I don't hate the West. And Danny, I won't speak for you, but I'll give you a chance to address this as well. I don't hate the West. I was born and raised in the United States. I believed in what I was taught as a kid growing up, so much so that I joined the U.S. Marines, and I was ready to give my life in defense of my country. The problem is, and I realized, and what many others realize when they actually go out and see what the U.S. is doing around the globe, is we're brutalizing people. We're subjugating other people. We are doing things that are wrong that we claim to stand against. Ideologically, superficially, we say we're against this, and yet we are the worst people doing it all around the globe. I've seen it with my own eyes, and I oppose that. I don't hate Americans. I am American. I hate what these special interests are turning America into. And that is entirely different than hating the West. That is such a broad stroke, such a generalization. And unless you could qualify it a little more specifically, I think it's a bit dishonest or a comment made in bad faith. What do you think about that, Danny? Do you hate the West?
Yeah. Well, it's such a, I think it's a very superficial question because, and I think it really is a dog whistle of sorts. It's really meant to generate a kind of blind fury of dogma around, you know, this whole question of, well, what are we really living under? What is really going on here? It obviously comes from a place of someone who doesn't necessarily love the West. They like the system or have solidarity with a system that in many respects destroys the West. Not so much destroys maybe the ideological bedrock of empire or the influence of that on culture, on damn near everything. And certainly it doesn't it doesn't have any impact on the policies that Western governments, led by the United States, pursue in the fields of war and, for our purposes, war, but in general, the policies they pursue in the interests of what? The West or a very particular small, tiny fraction of the West that just so happens to control the political and economic mechanisms that
I was
determine how
just
we
gonna
live.
say, Danny. Yeah, I was just gonna say. I mean, those interests that you're talking about. Do you honestly believe that they represent the majority of the people living in the West? I would say no, and I would say the people in the West. People accuse me of hating the West, but I feel just as bad for the vast majority of people living in the West as I do for other victims around the world, because the population, the public in the West, are also victims of this system that you're describing, Dan.
Yeah, they are, and I think I've dedicated my work toward exposing that very reality because one of the most challenging, I think, difficult parts about the so-called West, and really what we should be talking about as empire, is that it attempts to corral as many people as it can to essentially march alongside with it. And that's the whole concept, the whole reason why something like American exceptionalism or Western exceptionalism in every single strand in piece of that ideology. It's the reason why it exists. It's to create a kind of common sense for everyone to latch onto, as many people as possible, as it sows divisions within the population, as it endows some with some benefits and the rest with absolutely none of them. But the idea is that all of that is tolerable so long as there is something to hold on to, some value system, some idea. And this is what we really do need to fight against. We do need to oppose that. We need to show what the West really is, not in terms of ordinary people, not blaming people who have no control over the situation, but showing who actually runs this and why they run it the way they do. And that is why it's so important to talk about empire in the way that we do, because it does reveal the quality and the character of the biggest conflicts and really some of the most important developments occurring worldwide, which shape all of our lives. What happens in Ukraine shapes all of our lives. What happens in Gaza shapes all of our lives. It does have a huge impact, and it reflects even the day to day with which we live. There's a reason why there are, so many people struggling, not able in the United States. There's something like half of the people in the United States don't even have enough money for like a $500 or $1,000 emergency. You have more than half the population like that, but yet there's millions, billions, and trillions being spent on from building $1 million drones to supporting Ukraine with $100 billion. That reflects something, a division, a conflict, not just geopolitically, but also amongst forces in society that have to be revealed and have to be exposed. And so that's why it's important to. It's not about hating the West, but we should really hate living in a system that treats us like this, and that ultimately sacrifices so many human lives and destroys so many human lives, whether they're being killed or whether we are living just threadbare. Regardless of the situation, we should hate that. It's not about hating the West. The West overall, if the West were governed by people who had the actual interests of the people at heart, if the West acted like a functioning um, um, system that followed international law and that paid the debts that now it owes to just so many countries around the world and so many people around the world that it has stolen from and destroyed. If that were the case, then the West as a concept would be something to admire. But right now, it is not, because it still moves in the image of a centuries-long project of empire building. And the problem is the people who ultimately are pulling those levers. And of course, the biggest challenge is moving people away from looking up to that and feeling like they have a stake in that, or maybe just ignoring that or having no idea what's happening. It's moving people in those positions toward a more, um, toward a more active role in building something different.
Yeah, and I put this up on the screen because I think the same people who would accuse us of hating the West when we clearly dislike the system, we understand the people are victims of it. And I've traveled around, and Danny, you've traveled around quite a bit now. You see everywhere you go, people are people everywhere you go. There are no good or bad people in general. There's certain specific interests that are good or bad. And we see here Chinese people love their government. So if you can't say you love Chinese people but not their government, you're not supporting the Chinese people, and that's very true. And I think we know these people who say I don't hate Chinese people, I just hate the CCP, which is not even what it's called. It's the Communist Party of China, CPC, and they do that deliberately. And when you dig just even slightly under the surface, you see that they're racist. They hate Chinese people. They hate everyone outside of the West. And attacking the Chinese government is just a way for them to couch that racism. And that's the interesting thing about racists. They think they're better. They think they're smarter, but they're afraid to even talk about what they really believe in. Why do they hate the Chinese government so much? And this is kind of getting us back on track to talk about your trip there and elsewhere here in Asia. The Chinese government is actually making decisions and pursuing policies that reflect the best interests of the people living in China. The people in China, and as an impact of China's rise, people in this region are living better lives than they have in the past. And I would say increasingly better lives than people in the West live, because they have access to affordable healthcare. affordable housing, affordable educations, jobs. There's infrastructure being built that you can tangibly see. When you look at the last 5 or 10 years of progress, you can name a list of actual projects that benefit everyone in China and even in the region. Can you say the same thing about the West? And you hear even people running for office, and they have these very ambiguous campaign promises that I'm not even really sure what they even mean. They never come out and say, I have this specific project, we're going to work on it for X number of years, and it's going to produce this, and we'll have this for everyone's benefit. You don't hear that in the West anymore. What are your thoughts about that, Danny? And maybe you could start talking about what you actually saw in China versus what people think they've seen. And while you're doing that, there's this other question. I'm trying to do two birds with one stone here. Are there any good resources online on Chinese domestic affairs that is not Western propaganda or Chinese state media? And maybe you can talk about some of the people that you know or met that are sharing information that is not. But again, a lot of people, this will be the last thing I say, a lot of people will see something that they want to believe China is bad. They will see someone say that it isn't, and then they will say, oh, well, but that person works for CGTN. Yeah. So they're just lying. I mean, there's ways you can look into it. There's ways you could even just read through the Western media. That's what I do. I only reference the Western media, and I show even in their own articles, buried deep in the article, they eventually do tell you the truth. So there are ways to tell, even from bad sources.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a huge question in terms of my trip. I mean, yeah, in July, I visited China, and I just got back not a month ago from Vietnam. But the trip to China was my second time, and it just verified a lot of what I learned the first time I went. But this time I was a bit closer to what I think was an attempt. It was before there had been any real significant thought in even just the people-to-people exchanges. That's starting to increase. There was something like, when I went, there was something like 20 flights going from the United States to China. So I mean, we're talking about a significant decrease in just the relationship in general, a real decline in it. So I went at the tail end of that, and now things are starting to really, out of U.S. desperation, pick up a bit and improve a bit. But when I went, it was around the time Janet Yellen was visiting, and when I went, I mean, China is a very, I think, just difficult. It's difficult to grasp for people, especially people in the collective West, who, one, have only been fed anti-China messaging and propaganda from the mainstream media and their political class, and two, the fact that despite the improvement in relations since normalization up until, let's say, the pivot to Asia, despite the massive economic relationship that the U.S. and China built together from around 79 to 2012, 13, despite all of that, was still not a lot of understanding about China's system, what China is trying to do, what its function in the world was, what its role in the world was. And a lot of that was because the basis of the relationship was unequal. There was the idea, especially from the U.S. political class, that, well, China is still very poor. If we normalize with China, we can reap an economic whirlwind, and they did. But that economic whirlwind will blow over the Chinese government, and China will just become like a lot of the countries we see in the global south, with dependent governments and so-called parliamentary democracies that are really just appendages of the United States and client states that do their bidding. So that never happened. And then China started to develop and build on a more equal footing to the United States. Its military became stronger, and of course its economy grew to such a scale that now it's going to surpass the United States within the decade. So that explains, I think that foundation explains why it's really hard to understand China. And so when I have gone to China, it is always just a lesson in what you see is far different from what you hear. You do see, wherever you go in China, you do see the benefits of the poverty alleviation. You see the confidence of Chinese people. Everyone talks about lives improving. Not everyone loves the government, but most people support the central government. And you just witness, where I went, you see how, despite China being a very diverse country, having more than 50 ethnic groups, I believe the number is around 56 different ethnic groups. You see, as because every time I went to China, I've gone from east to west. So I went from Beijing. This time around, I went to Gansu province, which is really far west. It borders Xinjiang. I went to Lanzhou, and I went to Dunhuang, and then I ended in Shanghai. I mean, these are all very different places, but regardless, China views development just so much differently. It does attempt and if you go to Gansu province, you see all the attempts to maintain cultural heritage, to maintain and respect ethnic diversity and the various ways that different ethnic groups want to live. But you also see a lot of attention to bringing everybody up to the same level of economic development, so much so that language like tiered cities is just how people talk in China. They'll say, "Oh, Shanghai, that's a first tier city," and then they'll say, "Oh, well, Lanzhou is a third tier city." But no matter what tier the city is, each city is being given attention around development and improving people's livelihoods, and of course, improving the pace of development so that not only people can live better, but that China as a whole can progress economically, technologically, etc. So when I went to China the second time around, a lot of that was confirmed. And I was also able to be around former diplomats, people with, they were all there to go. We were all there to go to a conference on talking about mutual learning and people to people exchanges around the question of civilizational diversity, because that's a huge part of the Global Civilization Initiative as part of the 3 initiatives under Xi Jinping. And no matter what you see is that even when we talk about something very specific, like how do we respect different civilizations? How do we respect the fact that there's so much difference in the world? It all always went back to this question of development. Everyone talks about development. Everyone wants to live better. Everyone wants to be able to have access to things that will improve their quality of life. And this is something that China can actually offer. And that's because it not only has the economic means to do so, but it has a political system that is truly and genuinely dedicated to doing that for itself and for the rest of the world. It is committed to peace. It is committed to integration. It is committed to not rising tide lifts all boats, not the fraudulent statement of people like Bill Clinton, who used to talk about that under his administration, but actually using the growth and the technology and all the things that China has been able to accomplish and share it with the rest of the world so that they can do it for themselves. And that is a huge emphasis in China. It isn't, I wouldn't call China some kind of like anti-welfare state kind of country, but China and Chinese people are very prideful in how they were able to, for so long, maintain sovereignty and develop on their own when they were isolated from the rest of the world. And now that they are open up to the world, they are very proud in being able to maintain their culture, their political system, their economic development model, despite the fact that there have been so many pressures to do otherwise, in lieu of the immense pressures after the Cold War ended. So, given this, Chinese people and the Chinese government, they see their assistance to the world not as charity, not as humanitarian assistance, even, but as just a mutual kind of relationship, win-win cooperation, we could even call it, where China benefits and they benefit, but they can do it for themselves. It's the China is not running these things. They're not going there and saying, okay, well, we'll operate within your political system so you can actually make these projects happen and sustain them. Oh, and we'll also just control political life here. No, it's all about giving everyone in the world the ability to um, make their own way. And China calls what they've been able to do economically a miracle. And it truly is. When you go to China, you see how there is hopes that they don't want to do it for them. Certainly, China has a lot of things to resolve themselves, but they want to see the rest of the world also prosper too, in whatever way they want to do it, however they want to do it. So, China is always a great place to visit for that. It is always a lesson in what it means to follow a model that isn't based on interference. It almost can feel like this combination of being like overwhelmed by the fact that China is progressing so rapidly, and even with all these talks of economic collapse in China, and China isn't as big of a share of global GDP as it once was, with no acknowledgement of the fact that the Chinese government, especially under Xi Jinping, has long left the idea that GDP growth for GDP growth's sake is something to prioritize. China truly is looking at quality growth at this point. But even so, we're talking about a country amid a global recession for many years because of COVID, and then these conflicts like Ukraine that NATO has spurred.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Because we do hear. I was trying to ask this like a couple of seconds
Oh,
ago, but I was
sorry.
muted. No, I was muted, so there's no way you would have heard. But you see these videos. China's economy is collapsing. 6 months it'll collapse, and we've seen these type of videos for years now. So for years they've been saying China's going to collapse in 6 months or a year. When you went there, did you see evidence of economic collapse? Or because when I talk to people in the United States, I hear about I can't afford my medical bills. I have to pick between paying my rent and bringing my dog to the vet. I can't afford to do these essential things. That seems like a country that is slowly grinding towards some sort of collapse. What do you see when you're in China, though? Any evidence of maybe a slowdown that is understandable, but economic collapse? Did you see any evidence of that?
No evidence of economic collapse. The problem with the collapse narrative is that it assumes that China's economic model is designed somehow to collapse, which no point in China's history, not even in the worst times, so you could argue, oh, well, what about the Great Leap Forward? What about the Cultural Revolution period? At no point was the economy even close to collapsing at those periods. And there were massive challenges, both globally and internally, that made it very difficult for China to to progress. But even now, right, amid a global slowdown, which inevitably has both the global economic slowdown and the fact that the United States has been attempting to strangle the biggest and most lucrative sectors of China's economy, namely the tech sector. Despite all of these things, even if there has been a slight slowdown, it has not even at any point led to such a reduction, even in just nominal GDP growth, to even think that there was going to be a collapse. I mean, at this point in 2023, China, I think, is going to end with somewhere around 5.5% GDP growth. That is 2 to 3 times better than most countries in Europe. That's going to be 1.5 to 2 times better than the United States. And China, unlike the United States, doesn't have a model where that slowing economic growth translates into more pain for people. China has the ability to redirect into quality growth in ways that the United States just can't. because the United States has a very particular model where it is based on cutting back in harder economic times, where it is about preserving the richest among us at the expense of everyone else. In China, that is not the case. In China, there has been an even further doubling down on improving the standards of living of people. So while there is, and you could see it like even in Shanghai when I was there, you can see that there has been a slowdown of sorts. But where is the slowing down happening, namely? Well, it's happening in mostly the Western centers, the more Western centric centers, where people are redirecting their focus and energy more on Chinese brands, more on developing the Chinese economy. So foreign direct investment, this is one of the, I think, big takeaways about China is that when you think about the Chinese economy, a lot of people think about opening up and reform and China's relationship to the West as one that was extractive in nature, in the against the interests of China. But actually, what has happened is that even as Western investment has tried to, run away, they've been trying to listen to some degree, although not to a huge degree, to the US's, wagging finger sanctions. Despite the impact of that, China has been redirecting its energies back into its own economy. And so, of course, there's going to be some slowdown in certain areas where that investment has been redirected. But then you see China able to achieve sort of hallmark feats like releasing a phone with advanced semiconductor chips just a few years after basically being sanctioned to the point where thinking about that kind of technology being produced was just not even in the cards. And I spoke to people when I was in China, and that's how they talked about it. They said, well, Huawei was facing these sanctions, and then there was investment bans, and then there were real efforts to isolate China's tech sector. And for that first year and a half, this is how China thinks. That's how China develops. It's like they're trying to advance every 6 months, every year to another um, technological feat in the realm of telecommunications, computing, all of that. So yeah, there was a year and a half where things slowed down a bit. And then suddenly, because their energy was redirected, because their resources, because the economy looked toward itself, uh, it only took a couple of years to be able to catch up. And it even bamboozled, although I do think they knew that this was happening. The United States acts like it was bamboozled. How could this happen? You see articles now all the time. How is China just getting? Where are the loopholes? There's so many loopholes in these sanctions. It's not about loopholes. It's about that China has the ability to um, learn from its relationships to benefit itself and, around the world, so it can benefit. And it has used that technical know-how in times of intensifying war to ensure that it still is able to maintain the progress that it has set out for itself. So China is fine in the sense that it has goals that are being worked toward. There's always going to be external pressures. It is going to have an impact because there is this target on China's back, but nothing of the sort of some kind of collapse is occurring. Actually, what is more likely to happen, and what has been happening over the last several years, is that Chinese people, even people who are not sympathetic to the Communist Party of China and the Chinese government, which is a dwindling few, but even people in that camp in China, just like in Russia over the Ukraine conflict, like even people in that camp are seeing it necessary to protect the sovereignty of China, meaning that the government and the overall project of developing around these goals and the 5-year plan only become easier. So it is this kind of push pull, but ultimately what's going on is that China already has the foundation to not go it alone, so to speak, but to uh, move independently of US and Western pressure. There really isn't any kind of pressure that they can exert which will cause a collapse really what it's just going to cause is the rise of multipolarity to accelerate further, and for China to necessarily have to become more assertive in areas where it honestly does not want to be assertive because it does not look for war or conflict in any regard. But that is where the United States and whoever wants to follow it is ultimately walking. But when I was in China, no signs. People are living as best as they can in circumstances that are more difficult, albeit than they were maybe pre-COVID times. COVID-19 plus a looming geopolitical crisis fueled by the United States. I mean, those things do have an impact, but they do not have the impact to the degree that could really do anything but make China more resilient in the long term, even if there are some short term, really nuisances, drawbacks, maybe, and setbacks that China is more than capable of handling.
Well, a lot of people, when they think about the Chinese economy, they just think about factories, things like that that they see in the news, but they don't, I think, understand. And President Xi Jinping even said, the Chinese economy is like an ocean; it's not a pond. And when he's talking about that, he's talking about not just the size of it, but the variety within it. And anyone who's been to Asia, they will see there's everyone is doing business, massive corporations, state enterprises, all the way down to just everyone on the block is doing some sort of business. And I think it's the same in China. Maybe you could tell us, when you travel around, I mean, what was the state of the infrastructure? Did you see these small, tiny businesses working side by side, or like right next to a giant supermarket? Because here in Thailand, you will see a giant supermarket. Everyone goes there and spends money, but then they also spend money on all the shops right outside, right next to it, or sometimes renting space inside, right outside the entrance. And it's so much economic activity. When people say collapse, I mean, what do they think? They think people aren't going to buy and sell food. They're not even with, because technology is allowing even just a small, tiny, like 2 or 3 people set up a small business making things, customizing things. I mean, there's so much that you can do to just keep society running. What do they even imagine? What does it economic collapse even mean? And so maybe you could just tell us, what did you actually physically see as you were traveling around, the state of the infrastructure, the types of businesses, economic activity people were doing?
Well,
Like
I
that.
mean, China is overwhelming in terms of economic activity. It's so big. I mean, I truly do wish that one day I get a large period of time in any one, especially the major cities, because of course those are like the heartland of the economic just absolute prowess of China. It is quite astounding. Really, really, what you see is you see everything in China. But I think what's often negated is the fact that and this was the impetus behind the opening up a reform from the very beginning. It wasn't to allow the McDonald's's or the Starbucks or major massive Western monopolies to just come in, park, and essentially gain impressive amounts of tax cuts and do whatever they want, pay people however they want, all of that. Like, that wasn't the model. People always look, oh, well, Apple builds their phones in China and Foxconn, and it's so exploitative. People make a lot of money in factories in China. Every time I've been to China, people say, well, people like to work in factories because they make pretty big salaries, and those salaries then can last them. They can work 3 to 4 months, then they can go home. They can live in the countryside where they're actually from, and they can, and that's how they kind of build their livelihood. The the But in terms of just like day-to-day life when you're in China, what is so striking is that you have, of course, and this is just a fact of life in China, uh, you know, the what could be called the commanding heights of the economy, the biggest sectors of the economy. That's all state owned. The government operates that, so those resources are allocated in a way that benefits China. But the rest of the economy is like a bustling, mainly a small business driven, medium-sized business driven economy outside of like the Western centric areas of Shanghai, where, you know, you go to Zara and places like that, a very small part. Most of the other parts I've been to in China, it is mainly uh, uh, just a plethora of Chinese businesses doing business, like operating normally within the market, selling products, and it is truly, um, I mean, it is overwhelming in the sense that there's this huge market, and I've been lucky enough to go into the domestic tourism areas. I've been to Urumqi in Xinjiang, which is one of the biggest now sites that people like to go to, contrary to the Western mainstream media that always paints Xinjiang as this horrible, terrible place. Actually, a lot of Chinese people like to go there and have some fun because it's a really cool place to go. And it's so different than like Beijing. If you're from Beijing, you're from Shanghai, you want to go to Urumqi because you get to, you know, you get a taste of West Asian culture, all the different ethnic groups, all the foods, the sites. It's really interesting. So I've been able to go to Gansu province and Xinjiang province, and even in places like that where the economic level of economic development is much lower, I mean, the amount of domestic tourism is truly overwhelming. This time around, when I went in July, like, you really, it's hard to even move in areas. I went to a night market where, you know, it was crowded in Dunhuang. It was crowded. It was like 2 a.m. and it was packed. So people like to have fun. People are eating their kebabs. People are drinking beer. We had a drink with this gentleman from Inner Mongolia, and you know, he had like 5 beers in a matter of what felt like 2 to 3 minutes. He was having a lot of fun, and he was like, "Wow, this is the first time I've ever met people from, you know, from the West, from the United States. I've never, you know." Inner Mongolia is a very far-flung place. If you're from there, you're probably not going to meet many people from Europe, from the United States. We were with someone from Africa, from Kenya. You know, you're not really gonna meet people like that. And but the whole area, it was a night market. It was, you know, it was uh, because the Hui Muslim population is big there. It was mainly driven by families and businesses of that ethnic group, and you know, it was a great time. So these are the things that you can see in China and you can witness in China that shows that you know, the economy actually is doing uh, just fine. It's not where it was 10 years ago. They're not growing at a pace of 9-10%, and that's because the conditions are different both globally and within China. There's much more emphasis on, okay, well, how do we integrate the rest of China with the big economic centers? How do we alleviate the rest of those who are living in relative impoverishment? How do we take care of problems specific to China and specific to development? All of those things actually take pretty massive investments and spending that, um, in nominal terms, in GDP terms, a lot of the so-called market, you know, the world market economy would look at as costs that aren't worth making, that aren't worth spending on, that aren't worth investing in. But China sees things differently. China thinks clean air is important. China thinks having renewable energy is important. And China believes that ensuring that everyone is lifted to the same level of same standard of living is important. And that is not necessarily measured in GDP terms, in the ways that the West likes to talk about it, because the West doesn't care about any of that stuff. Because those who lead the West, they only care about how to make a very tiny few people rich while waging wars and doing whatever it takes to make that happen. And that is not the sign of a healthy economy. When I go to China, I always see huge signs what a healthy economy looks like: massive investments in infrastructure, massive investments in the livelihoods of people, and even if spending quiets down or real estate development quiets down, China's pursuit of goals that benefit all of China don't slow down. They don't. So that is the difference between China and the United. When the United States is in economic crisis, what happens? Well, lots of people get thrown out of their homes. People end up in massive amounts of debt. more, there's a higher rate of poverty, and you can bet that the defense budget for some reason is going to increase because there's going to be more wars that people need to hang their hat on in order to, ease some pressure. And of course, for the ruling elite to attempt to stabilize their own problems that they've created. So it's such a different, it is just such a different experience. And it's one that, in this era, I think in this moment now where there's this, what I call, I think it's mainly a fake shift on the part of the United States, but it does have some fruits that have been born. There are more flights now, even though it's kind of a pathetically low number still, to China. And there is just a cooler atmosphere because the United States is just so overstretched in other parts of the world. I think it's important for especially people in the collective West to consider making trips there happen so they can see for themselves that no matter what the situation is, whether it's China's not collapsing, China is collapsing, no matter what the mainstream media is saying, that ultimately what you see in China is a pretty steady progression. I mean, I feel lucky I was able to see from 2019, 2020 to now. I even went back to Dunhuang, though I had been there the first time during my first trip there, and I was able to witness the fact that they had built a theater in that time, like Grand Theater. And then I went there and I saw a great show. It was pretty incredible, pretty beautiful show about the Silk Road, held by people, performed by people who were deaf and who were blind. It was an incredible performance. It was, celebrating the first archaeologist in China who, was from Shanghai, and she, after college, she moved to Gansu province, which at that time in the 1960s was like one of the most impoverished places in the world, with nothing there, no industry, no infrastructure. And she went with the goal of pursuing cultural preservation and helping that part of China tell its story, tell its history. What is this all about? The Silk Road is a very interesting historical phenomenon. And Gansu province is huge in China, and no one up until that point had been able to really develop any kind of cultural and historical understanding of it because China was in such a terrible economic position from the century of humiliation. So she was celebrated. It was a really great time, but that theater was not there when I had went the first time. And so this is I think, a testament to China's economic development and what China is trying to do, um, for itself, and of course, in its larger role as a facilitator of this multipolar world.
Yes, and a couple of things that you've been saying that I've been marking down here. Misconceptions about China, and then maybe we can talk about your trip to Vietnam. And I've covered the situation here in Southeast Asia. You've actually been to Vietnam, so maybe we can make some of this, put these pieces of the puzzle together. A lot of people you'll hear. So you were talking about economic growth. As a country becomes more and more developed, the pace of economic growth slows down. That is a natural thing. But what the West does, the West does this all the time. The Western media, they know that, but they know ordinary people don't know that. So they can just show, oh, look how the growth rate is going down because their economy is collapsing. When in fact it's just is becoming more developed. Or they'll just pick out one industry and they say, look at the real estate industry, all while trying to convince people that the Chinese government is some sort of communist dystopia. The whole reason they've had problems with the real estate market is because it was underregulated. So it's just another irony that they hide out in plain sight. And then as you talk about quality development, it's so important. We see in the West, the type of growth that they have, as you've said, it benefits a very tiny percentage of the population, and everyone else is left to pound sand, quite frankly. And whether things are going better or worse, it doesn't matter because ordinary people are not seeing that. And investment in infrastructure is something that I've actually started taking for granted here in Thailand. A lot of the roads are in really good condition, maybe not inside. Bangkok is a different story for different reasons, but you go outside of Bangkok, and you would think, well, the roads are probably worse. No, they're actually very good. The train system is not that bad. They're improving it. They're also building a high-speed rail link together with China, and so you see that they are taking money from the people, from state enterprises, and they're reinvesting it in the country. It's not perfect, but you can tangibly see the benefit of this. In the United States, it seems like you can't. You really have to dig hard to find anything that is actually benefiting people. And the same goes for China. You're looking at the infrastructure drive. You know, in the West, they would take all that money and pocket it as profits. They are putting it back into the country. And not just because there's just such good people, good-hearted. They understand that sustainable profits require these type of investments. If you're, it's like a farmer that eats all of his animals on the first day. You're not going to have it's not a farm anymore. You gotta cultivate it and take care of everything and use it as you need it and continue to grow it as you need it. So I think that's a good way of another way of putting some of the things that you were saying. And then you were talking about how China solves poverty. And this is something that struck me when I was reading The Governance of China, the book right here. It's a collection of speeches by President Xi Jinping. And all he talks about is using work and education to solve poverty. They're not just handing out. When you think of in the US, how do they handle poverty? They just throw money at you. They get you dependent on government programs, and they're not doing anything to actually improve your life. And they know that is not going to improve your life. It's just going to make you dependent. In China, your options are improve your education. You want more money, get more education. We're not going to pay you more for doing the same thing. We'll give you education so you can do more and make more money. And you have to work, obviously. So these are a lot of differences that I think Westerners are unaware of because their media does not inform them, especially people kind of leaning toward the right, and they're just allergic to anything that they think is communist. But in reality, China's approach to solving poverty, I think, would resonate more with them than people who think handouts are the answer. Work and education. How could you actually be opposed to that? So all very interesting. And like you say, Danny, people need to go to China and see it. But if you can't go, I highly recommend just go to YouTube and just type in these walking or driving videos where it's just a straight hour, no commentary, someone just walking or driving through a certain part of China. See for yourself. I guarantee you, if you've never seen it before, it's going to blow your mind. Now, Danny, you also went to Vietnam. What did you see in Vietnam specifically in terms of infrastructure, cooperation, or lack thereof with China?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question because for those who don't know, I'm sure many people who are watching you are aware. Vietnam is only about 30 years out from being sanctioned after a massive, just destructive war waged by the United States in the latter part of the war. But of course, France was the original colonial power that started the whole process. But Vietnam has this history where it defeated France, it defeated Japan, and then it defeated the United States to obtain its sovereignty. But that didn't happen until 1975, and then there was a 20-year period about where the United States maintained very harsh sanctions that ensured that Vietnam would remain incredibly poor, not least because it had been bombed into the Stone Age. So after this 30-year period, Vietnam has been able to rapidly, through a system very similar to China's. What's interesting about whatever differences China and Vietnam have with each other, which I think are overblown by the West. But despite those differences, if you look at how Vietnam, if you go to Vietnam, you can see a lot of similarities to the Chinese model of economic development, especially when it comes to opening up and reform and instituting elements of the market to ensure that growth accelerates, and so that there is more of a foundation to increase and improve the livelihoods of people. But there are key differences. And I think the biggest difference between China and Vietnam is that Vietnam is at a much lower level of development still. Its economic growth rate is comparable, if not sometimes surpasses that of China in this current period. But it has started from a much lower, it hasn't had as much time, and it also operates in much different circumstances, especially in the last decade plus. Vietnam has opened up in a period of another Cold War. And what I witnessed there is that Vietnam has had to walk a pretty fine line because it wants relations with the United States to improve. It sees itself as needing better relations with the United States to rectify, especially the problems that are left over from the war. That was a big part of my trip. I went with a group called Veterans for Peace. They have a chapter out there, and they are mainly involved in ensuring and supporting through both money and also, um, other kinds of support efforts to address the long-lasting and continuing ongoing effects of Agent Orange on the country. I went to many schools and orphanages related to that work. And for those who don't know, Agent Orange was a decade-long period during the Vietnam War, I believe starting in 1961, ending supposedly in 1971. But the United States dropped millions upon millions of tons of dioxin produced by Monsanto and DuPont um, onto southern Vietnam, poisoned the crops, and affected large portions of the overall population, but especially the south of Vietnam. So, and they did that because they thought in doing so, they would destroy all the foliage, destroy all the natural world. And this just shows how absolutely unhinged the United States was at the time. They wanted to destroy, they wanted to level. Sound
Pretty
familiar? Is
much,
what's happening over? They
pretty
wanted
much
to level Vietnam.
nuking Vietnam without
Yes,
using a nuke. Yeah.
exactly. They wanted to level Vietnam so that the guerrilla forces would be out in plain sight. They didn't take into account things like the Cu Chi tunnels, which I visited, where Vietnamese had been digging tunnels for literally decades since the period of French colonization to live under because they had been bombed and bombed and bombed and bombed so many times. They didn't take into account that people would only be hardened in their fight for independence when you're literally trying to poison them into submission. So the effects of Agent Orange are still ongoing. So we visited centers, supported their work. The founder of the chapter in Vietnam, Chuck Searcy, he runs a group called the Mine Action Center, and they do a lot of work on the unexploded ordinances, which continue to go off in Vietnam. But because of this kind of cooperation that Vietnam has built with certain sections of the United States, they've been able to address the situation. And so there is this fine line, right? Because now, and this was a very interesting experience, because you see the progress, Vietnam has made progress, but you also see some differences given that Vietnam is, I like to think of Vietnam now as in the position that China was in the 90s and the early 21st century. It was really in a position where it needed to open up as fully as possible to the rest of the world. And that has meant building very close relationships with, let's say, Japan, the United States. And at this point, United States and Japan are in different positions than they were in that period. They're in a position where they're corralling themselves into a Cold War, and it has led Vietnam to need to really walk a very fine line. And at times that line leads to differences with China, and other times it leads to growing points of cooperation. And so while I was in Vietnam, I could see a lot of that progress, but you do see that there's still a lot of inroads. And I think Vietnam and China, given that they had a comprehensive strategic partnership far longer than the United States and Vietnam has had established in September of this year, given that there is so much need in Vietnam, like Vietnam still has a long way to go in terms of infrastructure. There really isn't a public transit system. I think there's a single one in Hanoi that only reaches a few districts, built by China, by the way. But there's still so much left to do. A lot of this is because of the legacies of the war, so it's in a different position than other countries, even regionally. But the thing about Vietnam's system, maybe contrary to some other countries in Asia, like a South Korea or Japan, the livelihoods of people in Vietnam are very much the focus, similar to China, right? With fewer resources. So there is a huge focus on improving standard of living. On the other hand, there is, and I think this is a pressure that Vietnam feels to accelerate the pace of development. There's a pressure to ensure that people's livelihoods increase fast enough to protect itself, similar to China, from external pressures. And so it was very interesting to see. I went to Hanoi, Da Nang. I went to also a province called Quang Tri, much smaller, but very much at the center of the legacies of the US's war on Vietnam. It was one of the most bombed provinces, still has the most unexploded ordinances there in that province. And then Ho Chi Minh City, many still call it Saigon. And you can see the progress, but you can also see this delicate dance. This is a new Cold War. This is a moment where tensions are high. And Vietnam is a much stronger, very, very viciously independent, but at the same time operating within a world situation that does have Vietnam kind of hedging bets on both so-called superpowers. Right? Even though China doesn't see itself as a superpower, the United States does. But Vietnam is trying its best to balance that relationship. I think doing a pretty good job. But if it just, this is my personal opinion, from what I see, I think Vietnam could stand to benefit from an even accelerated relationship with China, maybe formal membership in the Belt and Road Initiative, because I think that would accelerate the ability to address certain problems in terms of infrastructure, especially the pace of it. So that is something to watch out for. I think there has been several visits between China and Vietnam's leadership. There's been a lot of rejection of the Cold War being built up by the United States. But in the arena of development, I think it's very impressive what Vietnam has been able to accomplish. But I think so much more could be accomplished if there was formal membership in the Belt and Road Initiative and the ability to have things like a transit system, to have a high-speed rail, which is always talked about in Vietnam, but it has not even gotten off the ground to any significant degree. So that was my impression, and some of this is also peppered by like complex relationships that date back to the Cold War and even beforehand. There is, I think, a leadership, just like in China, there's a pretty big leadership struggle. I think in Vietnam, there's sovereignty, there's a stable political leadership, and there is attention to goals that benefit Vietnam. But there's also, I think, divisions among how to handle the question of, the U.S.'s role in the Asia Pacific, China's rise. I think there are disagreements on that are still being worked out. And, because one of the narratives you often find as an American, if you go as an American or a Westerner, is, there's narratives like, oh, well, China colonized us for 1,000 years. What about the conflict between China and Vietnam? And while the political leadership has a consensus position on, number one, not making that a point of any kind of contention for relations between China and Vietnam, I do think that there's a reality that there is a sentiment of maybe being overly careful about relations with China in a moment where the United States is attempting to use whatever it has left to court Vietnam. And so Vietnam wants some of that support more than others. I think Vietnam really wants, especially, support around handling the legacies of the Vietnam War. But that means trade-offs. And that also means that there are factions in the political leadership, some of which I met while I was on the trip, people who run organizations like the Vietnam U.S. Society, etc. Like, people in that camp are definitely more U.S. friendly. And that means that there is kind of a diversity of, which is, I think, contrary maybe to what many people might think of a country like Vietnam. There's a diversity of political opinion and public and maybe even public opinion on this question, which does lead to complexities and decisions that are a reflection of the time. But I was very impressed by Vietnam's development, and I do believe that Vietnam, given that its pace as it grows, and this is how I see it, as Vietnam becomes more prominent as an economy in general, as it's able to, if it continues this pace of 5, 7, 9, 10% growth each year, as it starts to get bigger economically, I think we're going to see the United States push its limits and really propel this question of multipolarity in Vietnam into a much bigger stage. Right now, it's not really center stage. It's not really something that Vietnam is as concerned about because it has so many other issues to think about. But I think Vietnam will become a much more important player in a very rapid time over the next 5 or so years. And that means the prospects of Vietnam, and I do trust that this will occur, that Vietnam and China's relationship will improve even more so, and that will change the calculus a bit, because as I see it right now, the way that Vietnam is operating, it's good for Vietnam temporarily, but it cannot last given the situation in the region, given the United States' position, and given the fact that as Vietnam grows and as it refuses to go along with the aggressive aspects of the US's policy toward China, the more so that this honeymoon phase that the United States is trying to promote with Vietnam, the more likely that's going to end. And I'm pretty confident in Vietnam's leadership to handle that, in a correct manner, given what I was able to see.
Yeah, and that is something that you will see across Southeast Asia. There is this balancing act taking place, but I agree that it's not going to last like this forever. And as we've seen elsewhere around the world, the harder the U.S. is attempting to yank these countries away from China, the more often they end up just pushing them closer toward China. I think that is something that we're going to see. There's also this U.S. soft power should not be underestimated. The U.S. has spent decades and endless amounts of resources to control the information space all around China, also within China, until China began cleaning up and taking back its information space. So in Southeast Asia, if you go to a bookstore, you're going to see all of these books on the shelf published by the US, connected to these think tanks. I was just in the bookstore here in Thailand the other day, and I saw all of these books. Like, you could have been in a bookstore in the US, but it's just all translated into Thai. And it really does have an impact. Over the years, you will see people who should know better end up absorbing this information, and it shapes their mindset, and they will direct the country in a direction that runs contra to their own best interests, because they've bought into this myth, these illusions that US propaganda has created. I think that is a huge problem. Is a problem that I think Southeast Asia, especially, is going to have to work past. It's going to take a lot of time and effort. I don't even really see China doing much to. I mean, I guess because they have their own media now and it's beginning to get its market share, that will have an impact over time. But the U.S. really has very successfully wielded soft power against the best interests of the people in this region. I think Vietnam is also, to a degree, impacted. So that is very interesting. I agree with you, Danny. And I think, again, Southeast Asia in general, you can see the pivot. It's happening. If you were here 20 years ago and you saw how much influence the U.S. and Japan had over, say, Thailand, and how it has completely inverted now in favor of China, even with many people in leadership positions on all sides of the political spectrum still convinced that America is something that it absolutely is not. It is the march of time, and it cannot be stopped. So we went way past 1.5 hours, Danny, but that's okay. I hope people learned a little bit from your experience. Hopefully we'll have you back real soon about maybe for a roundtable with Angelo, or about something else. Can you tell people, if you have any final thoughts, please share them, and please tell people where they can find and follow your work.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, your point about soft power is a good one, because a lot of times people think of soft power as especially in this moment where color revolutions are so prominent. I think just color revolutions, but actually Vietnam has a pretty good handle on that. It was interesting going to the Vietnam Veterans Association and meeting with the president of it, and one of the veterans really wanted to know what is the biggest threat Vietnam faces, and the guy literally couldn't think of any, because Vietnam isn't engaged in any wars. It doesn't view itself as engaged in any kind of conflict with China or the United States at this point. So he couldn't think of any, and so he wasn't, one of our delegate, the veteran. He was not satisfied, so he asked again, and he was like, "Well, we have a small group of people who oppose Vietnam's development, and but they're mainly small, and most of them actually live outside of Vietnam, so it's not really a threat." So he almost like answered it with a non-answer. But I do think that soft power is even bigger than just color revolutions. It is the more China had to deal with this when in the early phases of its opening up and reform. Regardless, even if you're just trying to develop economic relationships, those economic relationships with a country like the United States, they're always going to come with attempts to attach major strings. And even if you don't even accept the political strings, I mean, we know that there were nefarious NED aligned forces, people like George Soros, who were, trying to work behind the scenes with the Tiananmen Square incident. We know that there was foreign interference, especially in the violent parts of that incident. So regardless, even if you're just building economic relationships, it means letting in and integrating with a system that is attempting to not just work with you, not just benefit from an economic relationship, but also to start to sow the seeds of political control. And so that, of course, is going to have an impact in Vietnam when Vietnam is very desperate, not desperate like, oh my gosh, please, 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 but desperate in the sense of it needs all the tools at its disposal to address the issues at hand, especially around the legacies of war. So Vietnam is attempting to manage what is generally unmanageable, but yet, and I think this is a key point, is that the United States always overestimates its own influence. The United States does think the leadership of the United States, the neocons, they think that they have Vietnam in the bag. I truly believe they think this. They think that the comprehensive strategic partnership means a whole lot, and that it's going to lead Vietnam into some kind of pathway toward the U.S. camp. And nothing could be further from the truth. Vietnam is doing what Vietnam needs to do right now. In 5 to 10 to 15 years, maybe I'll be proven wrong, but I highly doubt when I start to get into my older years that I'm going to be seeing a Vietnam that is some kind of a U.S. chip in a conflict with China. It doesn't even seem plausible given the fact that, like China, Vietnam has a very strong political leadership that does not allow itself to be dragged one way or another, but makes decisions and calculates decisions based on what's best for Vietnam at the time. So that's certainly the impression I got. And, it always comes with contradictions, just as China's process has been also very contradictory in the sense that it's had to balance many contending forces and developments at the same time, all in the interests of Chinese people and all in the interests of China as a whole. It really is the only way to develop at this time. There's no way to be insular. There's no camps. There's none of that at this stage of political and economic development. And so I believe it'll be very interesting to see. I'm actually very hopeful and optimistic that the conditions of the world situation are only going to drive Vietnam and China more and more on the same path, and that will lead to what I think is already happening, which is Asia becoming the focal point of all economic development in the world, in the focal point of multipolarity and an actually just system of development across all spheres. And I truly, I truly do believe that, especially given the fact I was talking to people when I was in Vietnam. I said, Vietnam is not so far away from being able to, one, have better standards of living like it does than people, let's say, in Indonesia, while also being able to reap the benefits of something like a high-speed rail. It really is very close. It's just a matter of time and when, when conditions are favorable and when that allows for more breakthroughs. And when people can find me, You just go to I think, Brian, you did a really good job in the in the pinned comment, I believe, or in the
Yes.
video description of this video. You can find me in all those places. Patreon if you want to support me, but of course, Telegram. Follow me on Telegram. It's a great place to follow me in terms of social media, and then of course all the other places that Brian lists. And on YouTube is my biggest platform, so you can just search my name on YouTube, or of course Brian's on my show a bunch, so we're not so far away from each other, and you can definitely find me at my name on YouTube, Rumble, and Rockfin. Just search my name and you can find my channel.
Right. Excellent. And thank you again, Danny, for taking time out of your evening there to join me here in my morning time. And everyone who tuned in live, regardless of what time zone you're in, thank you so much for spending this time with us. Please like and share. And again, check out everywhere you can find and follow Danny in the video description. And it will be in a pinned comment at the top of the comment section once we wrap this up. So thank you again, everyone. And until next time, bye for now.